just can't live without you. I don't know what to do. I just can't live without you. I don't know what to do. I just can't live without you. I don't know what to do. I just can't live without you. Listen to me. You've got me hooked. You got me bound. I can't stand it when you're not around. I shake and shiver when you're out of sight. When you're near, I gotta hold on tight. I don't know what to do. Oh no, I just can't live without you. I know, I know. I don't know what to do. Yeah. I just can't live without you. Hey, you build me up when I feel down. I'm gonna spread the word all over town. Only you can turn me on. I gotta have you from dusk till dawn. I don't know what to do. Oh yeah, I just can't live without you. Can't live without you. I don't know what to do. Oh no, I just can't live without you. Like roses need rain, I need you to ease the pain. When I'm feeling blue, you see me through. There's no one like you. I don't know what to do. Oh no, I just can't live without you. No, no, no. I don't know what to do. I just can't live without you. Live without you. When I'm with you, I feel I'm in heaven. You on my mind 24/7. You're the spark that ignites my flame. I've got to have you again and again. I don't know what to do. I just can't live without you. No, 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 no. I don't know what to do. I just can't live without you. Ah, yeah. I don't know what to do. Ah, yeah. I just can't live without you. Can't do without you, yeah. I don't know what to do. I just can't live without you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'd like to thank you all for coming. This is a pre-recorded presentation. This is for my US audience or anyone who is familiar with the underworld history of the United States and not so much of that of the United Kingdom. Now, the story I will be covering will be predominantly in the 1980s, but will slightly move on into the future. Now, this pre-recording has been drawn up for you to be able to draw parallels of the timeline that I will be covering and what was happening in London as well. So the United States. Okay. So during the 1980s, off to the Windy City, Chicago. So during this time, the outfit, Tony Ocado, whilst he still was the main figure, he took more of a backseat during this period, during the 1980s. And during the first half of the 80s, it was run by Joey Doves Iupa, who was in control of this period up until his conviction into the mid-1980s. And then on from there, it was Joe Ferrola, who then was in charge of the outfit during the rest of that decade. Okay, then moving over to City on the Hill. Raymond Patriarca Jr. He took over the reins from his father in the early 80s, and he was allegedly running things after his father's passing. Then over to the Big Apple. Okay, the Colombo family, allegedly run by Carmine Persico during this period. The Lucchese crime family, which was headed up by Vicar Musso, who is currently incarcerated today. Then during this time period, we had the Bonanno family, which was headed up by Phil Rusty Rastelli. Then the one that is globally renowned is John Gotti, who during this time period was the alleged head of the Gambino crime family. And last but not least, the West Side, the Genovese crime family, who at this time was allegedly headed up by Vincent the Chin Gigante. And more also as well, for a lot of the audience, the City of Brotherly Love, Nicodemo Scarfo, Little Nicky, who at this period in time was the alleged head of the Philadelphia crime family. So to get us giving you an idea of what we'll be covering. Now on to London. I just want to, this is going to be more related to what I'm talking about. So I'm just going to touch on a few characters. So starting will be the Clerkenwell Crime Syndicate, also known as the Addams Family or the A-Team. Okay, this criminal organisation was founded out of the London Borough of Islington in North London, and a large criminal empire. Okay, that was allegedly headed up by Terry Adams, along with his brother Patrick Patsy Adams and Sean Tommy Adams. Okay, now the Clerkenwell Crime Syndicate, this gang was allegedly heavily involved in drug trafficking and extortion, as well as the hijacking of gold bullion and shipments, as well as security fraud. Okay, now we have as well the Hunt Crime Syndicate. Okay, the Hunt Crime Syndicate is a criminal network that was founded out of Canning Town in East London and was headed up allegedly by David Hunt, aka the Longfella, who was linked or suspectedly linked to violence, fraud, prostitution, money laundering, and murder. Then we have a gang out southeast London, the Arif gang, headed up by aka Bakir Arif, aka the Duke. The Arif gang itself, okay, was to say based out of southeast London. They were a Turkish Cypriot criminal organisation heavily involved in armed robbery, drug trafficking, and other racketeering related activities within the London Underworld since the 1960s. And they, along with his brothers Mehmet and Dennis, as well as Dogan, they ran their criminal empire out southeast London. Now, also as well, we have Kenneth Noy, who's a career criminal. He's been convicted for handling stolen gold from the heist, and he was also convicted of murder, and is well renowned throughout the underworld of London. And then in the story, we have Brian Robinson and Mick McAvoy, who were two robbers that they were convicted and sentenced to 25 years for their main roles in the Brinks-Mat gold bullion robbery. So, as I said before, I'm going to be touching on this. I want to also just go through a few phrases and terms which my US audience, some may know, but some may not, just so that you get an understanding of what I'm talking about. So, first off, we have the terminology grass. A grass is someone who is a police informant, someone who testifies and works as a confidential informant as well. As you very well know, the term used in the United States you refer to is a rat. So a rat and a grass is the same thing. Another terminology I will use, you will hear me say, is to go across the pavement. Now that was used in the UK in the underworld, referring to armed robbery. Generally, the robbing of security vans, to go across the pavement. A pavement in the UK is your equivalent to the sidewalk. Now, also, we have a terminology for a blagger or blackguard. Now, that's someone who gets their way, gets their own way, the way that they want, in a clever way by saying things that are not true. Okay, so a blagger. Also, as well, another term that you probably will be familiar with is a fence. Someone who spends money to make money through criminal means, and this could be, giving an example, a fence could be someone who finances a job. Let's say a robbery. They'll put up money for weapons, tools, vans, disguises, whatever. But they will do that. They'll probably help plan the job, and they will obviously get a share of the criminal proceeds if a job was pulled off. So this topic that I will be covering, all the information I'm putting out is in the public domain, and most of it is going to be covered in a book that I will be covering, which I will be shouting out at the end of this topic. Now, while some of this information is true, I have to stress this, it can never be verified as 100% accurate. And the information is for educational, entertainment and satire purposes. And the story will probably be more than one episode, sorry. And this recording will be played at the beginning of each episode, and it will be interactive as well. So I do welcome any of your questions. So what I will say is this: I want to thank you all for tuning in, and please enjoy the live. Thank you everyone for sitting through that. First off, just before I go into it, I just want to welcome you all, and as good manners should be, I'm just going to go through the chat and greet everyone. So first off, Bambi, thank you for coming. Minnie the Moocher, Crewmel, Adam, as always, the main man, Mr. Tommy Stiggs, Dave T, always great to see you. Miss Sweet Tea, brilliant, thank you for coming. Who else we got? Marta, thank you. Claudio John Perry, I'm glad you can join us. Excellent. Co-train, good to see you, my man. Okay. Paul Kaiser, thank you for coming. And Stu D as well. Good to see you, Stu. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just quickly, give you a quick, brief overlay of what I'm going to be talking about. Now, this is the Brinks-Mat gold bullion robbery, which happened in 1983. And for those in the US, to draw parallels, you can kind of look at it as some of you may know of the Lufthansa heist. So I'm going to get in and start talking about what happened. I'm going to give you a bit of a background. As I say, this is going to go over a few YouTube lives, because I'm sort of running it in tangent with a book, and I will see touch more towards the end of the series of this. So first off, what I want to obviously start talking about first off is in 1983, Saturday the 26th of November. Okay, so what happened was, he said armed gunmen, they were due to carry out a robbery, and what that robbery ended up being was one of Britain's largest ever robberies. It was over £25 million worth of gold bullion. And this was bound for the Far East and was stolen from a warehouse, the Brinks-Mat warehouse, which is just outside the perimeter of Heathrow Airport. So what I'm going to do now is I want to share some more slides with you, just so you can get an understanding of what I'm going to be talking about. So if we go here. Okay. Okay. Here we go. Right. Okay. So you've seen obviously in the pre-recording, I showed you the map of London, but here what we have is London itself, and you can see highlighted here is Heathrow Airport. Okay. Now Heathrow Airport is the main international airport serving London, and the capital and most populous city of England and the United Kingdom, and it's the sixth largest international airport. Okay, so just giving you more idea of some pictures there of the 1980s of the Concorde, if you can remember. And this was at the warehouse where the heist happened. So I will go in more to it. So I'm gonna, okay, right. Okay. Right. So yes. So as I say, a group of 6 men overcame the guards at the Brinks-Mat warehouse. Okay. basically the target was they overcome electronic security devices, and the members of the gang, who were all armed, they stole over £100,000 worth of cut and uncut diamonds. Now, they disguised themselves as security uniforms to get into the warehouse and terrorise the guards, wanting them to obviously hand over the alarm codes. Now, the guards were handcuffed, and one of them was hit over the head with a pistol, and they all had petrol poured over them, okay? So once the robbers got inside in the safe, they used the warehouse forklift truck to transport 76 boxes of gold into a waiting van. Now, the alarm was raised around about 8:30 that morning, and the flying squads of Scotland Yard, their commander Frank Cater was leading the hunt for the thieves. Okay. Now, the Brinks-Mat gang, as they were renowned for, had expected rich pickings, but they never imagined the extraordinary level of wealth that they stumbled upon that day. And their audacious plot, ruthless in its conception and brilliant in its execution, just handed them the biggest haul in British criminal history. Now, the Brinks-Mat robbery will go on to make the names and fortunes of today's most notorious gangsters, and it become the stuff of legends. And its bloody tentacles provoked a vicious gang war in the underworld that was still raging, well, today. So, you're going to, as I go through the story, you're going to find out more on what this heist ends up setting up London and the future for it. Okay, so across the Thames from the City of London lies the borough that for centuries was effectively the second largest city in England, and that was the borough of Southwark, and of London Bridge. Now, Borough High Street runs directly from London Bridge, and this is dating back into 1197. Two tycoons swapped a pair of manors from their real estate portfolios, okay, and the Archbishop of Canterbury accepted Lambeth, which is another borough in London, on the Thames Bank, about a mile west of the borough, in exchange for Dartford in Kent. Now, the Archbishop decided to use his townhouse instead of adding this to his investments, and Southwark, in keeping, profited by the increase in travel between Canterbury and London. Now, Canterbury's down in Kent. Now, along the bank of the river, between East Lambeth and Southwark, the bishops of Rochester and Winchester bought properties which their successors leased out in Henry VIII's reign, Rochester's cook. Richard Ross poisoned the soup of a banquet and became the sole victim of Henry's new penalty for poisons, and he was boiled alive. Okay. Now, Winchester's property soon became notorious for its brothels. The carnival atmosphere of the Bankside was further enhanced by the bear-baiting ring theatres and the first of the South Bank pleasure gardens. All those attractions encouraged the criminals of the day to head into the crowds and pickpocket and scavenge off the rich visitors. Then they headed back to their homes in the dreadful slum areas of Mint Street, which is the south of Union Street. Now, to the east, numerous level works centred on the district of Bermondsey, which is in South London, but the drawback of the tanning industry was the obnoxious odour that drifted across the entire area. And as a result, Bermondsey developed an atrocious slum, and by 1840, Jacob's Island was the worst area of the urban deprivation in London. And it was these South Bank slums that the late 19th century cholera epidemic sprang from. Now, with the arrival of the railways, Waterloo Station dominated East Lambeth to such a degree that it dragged the residential neighbourhood down even further. And the riverside became the dismal region of filthy, rundown warehouses. Squalid Bermondsey became the epicentre of violence, ill health amongst the poor and deprived, mainly due to dreadful overcrowding. Okay. So I'm going to now take this time just giving you a backdrop of where they came from. So now the 19th century's most appalling infanticide took place at the old King's Head Tavern in Greenbank, Tooley Street, close to where London Bridge Station stands today in 1843. Brush salesman Edward Dwyer, whose propensity for violence had already become resulted in one heavy jail sentence. Was putting in the hard work. He was putting in the hard days drinking at the tavern. By 9 in the evening, his wife and mother-in-law had come in and started abusing him in front of his friends after being drunk. They slapped him and left him to look after his 3-year-old baby. Now, he left the child on the street outside until his drinking friends persuaded him to fetch increasingly in agitated Dwyer, began making bizarre drunken remarks about his pals. Now, blood on a brick, he said, would look very funny. Blood on the wall would look very queer. If a bullock's head was beat against the wall, there would be plenty of blood on it. Okay. So then, before they could stop him, Dwyer picked up the baby by its thigh and smashed its head on the bar counter over and over again. Bermondsey never shook off the stench of real poverty until more than 100 years later, when the combined efforts of Hitler's bombing raids and the economic realities of life in post-war Britain effectively flattened much of the Thameside slums. After the war, the descendants of many of those disease-ridden ghetto victims finally turned their backs on the cobble streets and were encouraged to start fresh in the suburbs, and were gradually sprouting up in the cleaner air and wider fields on the edge of southeast London. And this is basically where we talk about the Brinks-Mat and the curse begins. Now, without smog and the concrete jungles of the housing developments or shocking extremes of wealthy and poverty, these suburbs were supposed to represent an acceptable new face of Middle England, with many appealing features, but few of the old inner city's bad habits. People were desperate to move to these previously nondescript locations between central London and so-called Garden of England, Kent. And by the time of the Brinks-Mat gang were born, just at the end of the Second World War, these places were starting to assume a comfortable reputation all of their own. Now, none of the suburbs like Bromley, Bexleyheath and numerous other places developed around this time were particularly picturesque, but compared with the harsh, depleted streets of Bermondsey, Walworth, Rotherhithe and Waterloo, they were sheer luxury. Now, in any case, these suburbs also retain some traditional reminders of London life, a fine range of pubs, chippies and pioneer shops, and enough memories of the capital and its history to make sure they still felt like at home. Now, basking in relatively clear air away from the smoky industrial docklands close to the river, the image of these suburbs and their neat gardens as aspiring lower middle class and conservative was very true to a large extent. However, many of the new residents found it strange to have swapped those run-down round rows of the riverside terraces in which they had grown up for the characterless square bungalows that were the essential feature of the South and East London suburbs. Now, some of these residents' children would grow up to become the most feared and notorious characters in the criminal history, yet many had, yet many had what appeared on the surface to be the inevitable childhoods in those very same suburbs, even though many of their families still lived on the edge in the underworld, thanks to their connections back in the smoke, as London was known to all and sundry back then. Okay. Right, I'm just going to quickly check the chat. Okay, just see some new faces. Hello, Leo. Thank you for coming. Hello, Suzanne. Good to see you. Okay, Joe Delamora. How you doing? Okay. Right. Okay. Now, here we go. So, as I say, many of the youngsters worked mundane part-time jobs, and long before they left school, which simply fueled their obsession with earning big money when they grew up, nearly all of them cut their teeth on dodgy sidelines such as handling stolen bicycle parts, nicking radios out of cars, and even shoplifting. Everything was fair game: cigarettes, spirits and clothing. Often railway containers were raided at night and their contents would end up on local street markets the following day. Now, the Docklands were still a breeding ground for criminals, even if some of them had moved with their families out to the suburbs on the border of southeast London and Kent. Many of the husbands and fathers of the families in these new suburbs spent much of their time back at the old familiar haunts near the old Kent Road. Stealing remained a way of life. Now, when talking about some of those involved with the Brinks-Mat job, they agreed that from an early age that they'd boast to anyone who would listen about what they wanted to do when they grew up. Earn a big fat wedge of cash was always their biggest ambition. But a few of the youngsters saw their future in joining the job ladder and climbing their way slowly upwards. Now, their ambition was connected to one thing. They believed they could help them escape their lives and of relative poverty, committing crimes. It was much more lucrative than having a job in Civvy Street. Okay. Now, by vowing to be wealthy, they were effectively putting themselves under severe pressure, which meant they would find it virtually impossible to back down if things didn't go their way. Now, as former Cray Twins associate, the legendary Freddie Foreman explained years later, you went out and you took your chances and you did all the villainy and put your life on the line, your liberty on the line, but there would be a nucleus of people around you who'd make sure you survived. That was the way it was. But often these youngsters would, from a gang, go up in central London, steal wallets and people's belongings from tourist coaches parked in places like Constitution Hill near Buckingham Palace. Naturally, no one took notice of the kids, often deliberately dressed in shorts and a school cap so to appear harmless. These scallywags. So a scallywag, for those of you not aware, is a person, typically a child, who behaves badly, but in an amusingly mischievous rather than harmful way. A rascal. Now, these scallywags could make as much as £5 in just one day by selling everything they'd stolen onto a fence, knowing a fence was the most profitable and safest way of making money out of crime. Fences were superbly well organised and considered respectable businessmen in these communities back in the post-war era. Now, being a fence was a very profitable and crafty way of making good money out of crime without getting your hands dirty. Everyone, even the youngest children, noticed the aura surrounding them. According to Freddie Foreman, they got great respect because of their mannerism and their obvious affluent lifestyle. They always looked smart. They knew how to dress well. They'd have a little business going. They'd drive a decent car and they'd spend their money wisely. Okay, so I just want to stop there because I'm going to share my screen. Okay, because it's going to be relevant, obviously, what I'm going to be talking about next. So, where is it? Okay. Share. Okay. Okay. So Mick McAvoy. So Mick McAvoy there, he was the armed robber. He would go on to be the Brinks-Mat Robbery leader. And his mates, Nick, led off the roofs and collected scrap to sell down at the yards which had sprung up where Hitler's bombs had flattened buildings 10 years earlier. The youngsters, led by Mick McAvoy, were soon to be making 10 to 15 shillings a day from local fences in the Camberwell area, and these young scallywags grew up. But McAvoy and many others growing up in South East London preferred to be out and about on the main streets looking for opportunities, not scrabbling around on the rooftops. One of McAvoy's oldest friends later explained, even as a kid, Mickey had these sharp, beady little eyes and darted around in all directions, scanning the streets on the lookout for trouble or a chance to do a bit of thieving. We looked up to him even back then. He had an aura about him. You knew what he was capable of anything. Okay. Okay. Right. Let me just share my screen again. Let's get this right. Right. Okay, you've got that. You can see that there. It's Mick McAvoy there. Now, by the mid-50s, dock workers on both sides of the Thames, east and south, started losing their jobs as the post-war recession bit even harder. But they meant that they had to find ways of replacing the high wages and bungs that they'd been earning over the years. Soon, the only real high wages and bungs that still existed were as a printer in Fleet Street, where all the national newspapers continued to be produced in their millions. The print was a lucrative trade and often passed down through families, but in time, even print jobs began to be axed, something that sparked a feeling amongst many that had to go back to their roots in order to make a crust. Now, the area's new heroes were the pavement artists, as I mentioned, crossing the pavement. Robbers who'd scooped a few £1,000s on a job and then buy everyone a round of celebratory drinks in their local pub. Now, true, they'd sometimes get caught by the police and stand trial at places like the Old Bailey and go down the long stretch. But at least they lived in style. Many in these communities frequently got angry about the long sentences handed down to villains who were in many ways considered latter-day Robin Hoods. No one ever asked whether the criminals were whether the crimes were being committed were morally wrong. Often robbers were seen as simply providing for their families. Okay. Now, despite this on the surface, the relationship between the police and petty criminals remained a civilised one. Often they'd meet each other in the local pub and exchange pleasantries, even though they might have been nicked the previous week. Now, a lot of coppers and villains had been brought up in the same neighbourhoods, and some even went to school together in the mid-50s and the early 60s. Bank raids were usually carried out in the dead of the night, with a master safecracker pitting his wits against whatever security arrangements happened to be in operation at the time. But as lock design and security improved, tackling a safe became a much tougher challenge. Even the use of gelianite was no longer a sound bet. A device had been developed that, if triggered by the force of an explosion, simply threw extra bolts across the safe door. Now, villains introduced oxyacetylene torches to get around this problem, but those proved to be slow and cumbersome, and on occasion would actually reduce the contents of the safe to a charred paper before the door could even be forced open. Now, in the place of the Brinks raids, the armed robbery scene developed into an even more lucrative criminal enterprise. Wages had increased in post-war boom, and firms to hire companies to transport their cash to factories and offices on payday, usually Fridays. Now, there were no more professional security companies back in those days, but more often than not, 2 or 3 trusted workers in the company would be given a few extra bob to pick up the cash from a nearby bank. And if they were lucky, they weren't armed with a kosh. Now, they were armed, sorry. Now, inevitably, some workers began informing their associates about this transportation of relatively large sums of money, giving the villains the sort of essential inside info that they needed. As one robber from those days explained, it was easy pickings because of these guards were just ordinary workers and they didn't want to get bashed up or put up a fight to protect the firm's money. At the time, most wages were carried in canvas cricket bags that could be snatched in seconds, thrown into a waiting car and driven around the corner to a quiet cul-de-sac, usually near a railway path or a bridge where a changeover car would be waiting for them on the other side. Now, often the takings from such crimes were quickly reinvested into honest businesses. Now, the objective was to get enough money to retire after building up your straight business. Now, then you could obviously put your kids through good schools, buy your own home, get a decent motor, and maybe even manage a holiday abroad. Now, robbers eventually graduated to across the counter bank raids. Old-style attacks on bank safes hadn't required any confrontation on the part of the robbers, but going into a bank in a broad daylight did. So it was essential for the robbers to be able to guarantee control. And that's when firearms began appearing with alarming regularity on the streets of London. So banks responded by installing reinforced glass screens to protect their cashiers. The risk in such armed raids was obviously higher, but the rewards were generally lower. So once again, those intent on robbery began looking for new cash methods. Now, cash in transit seemed to be the answer. Now, because of the cash increase use of credit cards and debit cards, Britain has almost become a cashless society now, like most of the Western world. But back in those days, consumers still needed ready money and plenty of it. So it was no surprise that during the 1960s, specialised security firms began emerging to take place on the responsibility of transferring money. Armoured vans replaced vulnerable clerks carrying briefcases. It was these vans and their guards that became the new breed of robbers, primary targets, and it was the South East London firms, gangs of robbers who were soon dominated such crimes throughout the capital. Now, often wealthy older criminals financed these jobs, but they were rarely told the experts on how to go about their work. These robbers were through professionals. But as money in transit industry grew, so did the risk. Post office vans were considered to be a soft target because they often just had one driver and usually didn't even know how much cash was being carried. Now, the blaggers usually had a snitch inside the main office who would be able to tell them which days there was a lot of cash on board such vans. Now, a popular target was the pension run to post offices. Now, but they only intended to be if the villains were hard up that week, as the pickings were not usually much more than a few £100s. The ultimate reward for a career as a robber, besides the cash, was underworld fame. Okay, there was nothing like picking up the evening paper, seeing the banner headline, post office van hijack, and knowing that the local big time faces would immediately be able to tell who carried out the job. Okay, in the middle of this heady environment, prison became the natural breeding ground for even the bigger robberies, as criminals linked up with new partners inside while serving time. So the inside clink, which is the prison, was where you met different people and heard different stories and you learned your trade, so to speak. Prison, it's like a breeding ground. It's like going to university or going to college, explained one on Face, that many of these young Southeast London villains would soon be graduating with full honours. So I'm just going to stop there, folks. I'm just because I'm now going to be going on to chapter 2. Okay, I just want to. Is there any questions thus far? Okay, if you're still there, excellent. Okay, right. Ah, Ralph Mucci, good to see you. Excellent. I'm just giving out some wrenches. Hello, Spirit in the Sky. Hello, Suzanne. Excellent. Glad you're all here. Okay. So, chapter 2. This is I'm giving the backdrop now. As to we're getting there, as to just right before the heist. But this is going to give you some character build up on the people that are involved in the heist. Okay. Now, some young villains tried to go straight by enrolling in apprenticeships to learn a trade such as carpentry or bricklaying, but the pay was never enough to give them the sort of wealth they craved. Many being already obsessed with avoiding the financial struggles of their parents. Places like the Scala Dance Hall in Dartford, Kent, were popular with young South East London tearaways, such as Mick McAvoy and his old mate, Tony White. Okay, now they'd like travelling out to the suburbs because there were more young girls around in places like the Scala. No one ever paid the entrance fee. Instead, they'd climb over the back fence and go through a back door. That's where Mick McAvoy first came across characters like Ken Noy. So that's Ken there on the far left. Okay. Now, another ducker and diver, but not in the same class as McAvoy, but he was a softie from the suburbs. In McAvoy's mind, you can only be really hard if you grew up in the inner city areas. Now, in the 60s, a lot of the youngsters from in and around South East London dressed as mods with smart short haircuts, hush puppies, shoes, and blunt mohair suits, if they could afford them. The mods drove scooters, and their arch enemies were the rockers. So the greasy motorbike fanatics who grew their hair relatively long and wore tatty jeans and leathers. The mods and the rockers were the two main opposing youth social groups who emerged at the time, ahead of the skinhead cult, which came a few years later and was fueled by football crowd violence. Now, there weren't many frequent clashes between mods and rockers at weekends, and they were descended on the south coast resorts such as Brighton and Margate. And in the mid-1960s, being a mod and many of the aspiring southeast London hoods were a serious business. Now, their favourite bands were The Who, Spencer Davis Group, and many eventually graduated to the Small Faces. Naturally, the Cozzers, or the Police, or the Old Bill, we like to call them, were known throughout southeast London and Kent and tried to keep a close eye on various gangs of the day. But these youths were already used to police. Their attitude often manifests itself into a complete and utter disregard for rules and regulations, also a contempt for society. Now, a few youngsters back then took drugs such as Purple Hearts, which is basically, they were like a mixture of amphetamines and barbiturates. But the hard-nosed criminal types like McAvoy, they all steered clear of them. Drugs were an unknown territory in every, basically in every sense. Then the profits were very high because the market was so small. Now, in their mid-teens, many of these characters graduate to the local greyhound track, known as going to the dogs, and they could make themselves a few bob. The drug tracks were usually a hotbed of local villainy, and ever observant and perceptive youngsters like McAvoy and others soon worked out which members of the criminal underworld were really on the up. One villain later confided how he'd often slide into a bar at the track and sit in a corner listening to the dodgy dealings going down, and then use the information he gleaned and make money for himself. McAvoy and his old mate Tony White were fascinated by these tough, edgy old characters in their sheepskin coats who seemed to carry endless bundles of £5 notes around their pockets. Now, the twisted values they learned impacted upon those teenagers' lives with increasing frequency and sent them into something of a moral vacuum. Now, it seems from interviews with countless associates and friends of the Brinks-Mat gang that many of them grew frustrated as youths and developed bad tempers. Now, if they didn't get what they wanted, they would be hell to pay. Now, often a hair trigger reaction could be provoked by the smallest incident, but instead of taking a deep breath and walking away from potential difficult situations, many of these characters would steam straight into their opponents. It was almost a shoot now, ask questions later mentality. Those tough young scallywags went out their way to develop reputations as hard men, and they wanted their contemporaries to know that they wouldn't compromise in any way. Part of the fault lay with their parents because they did nothing to teach their children how to control their aggression. They never gave clear guidelines to their sons, and as a result, they were allowed to believe that they could get away with virtually anything. And most of this time, that's what they did, precisely that. Yet their minds, like many of the youths brought up in tough, uncompromising environments, were creative instruments which veered off into certain directions depending on their surroundings. Now, these characters would see a situation in a completely different way to others who'd be more respectful of a more respectable kind of background. Now, people's personalities are said to be psychologists and reflect a characteristic set of behaviours, attitudes, interests, motives and feelings about the world. Now, it includes the way people relate to others. Extreme forms of abnormal behaviour are supposed to be easy to recognise, but doesn't mean that they can be instantly rectified. Now, the over-generosity of certain people, the need for admiration and complete lack of empathy towards the outside of their own exclusive circle displayed by these young hoods are all classic indicators of narcissism. Nearly all of them had a sprinkling of obsessive-compulsive disorder thrown in for a good measure, a preoccupation with orderliness, perfectionism and control. Okay, well, that's when I read things like that, I take a debate on that. That's someone's opinion, not mine. So some of them, like McAvoy and Ken Noy, were already showing themselves to be what one might call born leaders. With that came a number of other attributes, such as a heavy build, often developed in the local gym, street wisdom and confidence beyond their years. The message was loud and clear: don't fuck with me. Now, young Mick McAvoy and his friend Tony White worked weekends as porters at the Covent Garden fruit and veg market, where they all humped crates around to earn a few extra bob. As they got older, they stopped going into suburbs and started going into heavier South London clubs on Friday and Saturday nights, where McAvoy in particular sometimes ended up having a right tear-up with rival youths. Another favourite hangout for these young hoods and their chums was a mobile snack bar on the south side of Albert Bridge, next to Battersea Park. During the long, hot summer months, hundreds of South London youths would turn up there until the police tried to move them along because their presence caused major traffic problems. Now, the hit first, last later attitude displayed by teenagers like McAvoy helped them gain confidence and power within their group of peers. One of the childhood friend explained, Mickey was quiet, but yet knew instinctively he was a powerful character. He had a real work ethic and wanted to earn big money from an early age. Now, other youths who went on to make their names in the South London underworld shared this intense work ethic. They expected to do some graft to earn a crust. But the difference with McAvoy and his pals was they were after rich pickings rather than paltry weekly salary. They wanted the good life and all the trappings. Now, despite poverty that had enveloped the desperate poverty had enveloped his family back in Ireland before they moved to Camberwell, heavily influenced McAvoy's home environment. Now, London's post-war youths were emerging from their parents. Abject poverty as a restless, rebellious generation determined to make a mark for themselves in the world. But while McAvoy and his mates were committing numerous petty crimes, they still retained certain standards and even had codes to abide by. Now, targeting a man walking along the street and stealing his watch was frowned upon. So we had morals around that back then. While raiding a cigarette wholesaler, locking up or breaking into shops at night was totally legit. So you don't rob from your own. Now, McAvoy, one of the London contemporary where he was a teenager, not grassing up your mates was taken for granted. No ratting, okay? As one old South London criminal associate explained, if you went on a job and you got nicked and the other fella who was on the job with you didn't grass you up, then he'd just done exactly what he was supposed to have done. I'd never look at someone and think, oh, he didn't grass me up. What a lovely fella. I wouldn't be with him in the first place if I thought he was going to grass on me. Grassing is a terrible and despicable thing. People like myself and best friends would rather fucking die than be a grass. Now, by his mid-teens, McAvoy and many of his pals had little need for any further education. They were bright, quick-written youths with an eye for the main chance, and many of them were already earning money by ducking and diving to adults who employed them in the markets. Now, McAvoy and his mates seemed humorous, happy-go-lucky characters, bursting with energy and deeply proud of their southeast London roots. Now, according to some of the contemporaries back in the late 60s, McAvoy's aggressive personality really thrived in the semi-criminal environment. McAvoy was the fast becoming the kind of person who only saw things from his own perspective. Other family members noticed how fearless McAvoy became in his teens, as well as the way he tried to manipulate situations to suit himself and at others' expense. He also often seemed incapable of realising that he'd hurt other people's feelings. He felt little remorse and certainly had no sympathy for the victims of his early scams and crimes. As I say, yet again, open to interpretation. Unless you met the guy, I take that with a pinch of salt. Yet beneath this rock-hard exterior layer on the inner sadness, McAvoy found it difficult to take part in the normal activities like sports that his peers were involved in. Being a teenager is supposed to be a time in which developing individual learns on how to be happy and derive happiness from as many situations as possible. This wasn't the case for McAvoy. Out on the streets of East London as a teenager, McAvoy carefully hid his true feelings, one old pal explained. Mickey didn't like to give anything away about himself. He seemed a bit tense a lot of the time, but his mind was always turning over, thinking about what he could get away with. He was incredibly observant. He'd spot things in the street before anyone else and made him someone who was always what you wanted on your side. An example of his sharp entrepreneurial eye were the road races to the coastal resorts like Ramsgate and Whitstable, organised by McAvoy and his crew. Like all the kids back then, the characters would eventually grow up to plot the most lucrative crime of the 20th century. Were obsessed with cars. Often their fathers couldn't afford them. Now, with war rationing and low wages and still considering a luxury, the naturally made cars were an object of great curiosity and envy for kids. As they grew up older, their fascinations would turn many of them into juvenile car thieves. These trips went a bit further. They featured young drivers who were already experts behind the wheel. Even though they were under the legal driving age 17, McAvoy and his mates all put heavy bets on who would win before the vehicle was always stolen, set off through London into the countryside of the southeast of England. McAvoy, in his mid-teens at the time, was the ringmaster of these trips and handled all the bets when they came in. Now, many of McAvoy's contemporaries have been petty thieves, but to become a real outlaw, you'd have to do everything your way. Nobody and nothing else mattered apart from the loved ones, of course, and that ruthlessness made you more feared and respected. No one would get away with pulling a fast one on Mickey McAvoy, because beneath that suspicion's expression lurked a cold, calculating individual capable of making split decisions that can mean the difference between life or death to certain individuals. Naturally, the young Mickey McAvoy played up to his growing reputation. When he walks into certain taverns, the place really did go quiet like it did in the movies. But McAvoy wanted to do more than just a bit of local muscle. He saw himself as a leader of men, a skillful criminal capable of taking on and beating anyone, especially the arch enemy, the Cozzers. McAvoy, who had boxed at a local club where he'd gained a reputation as a ferocious fighter, remained, according to his childhood friends, very handy with his fists, so no one dared take him on. Those who knew him back then says McAvoy was solid, not particularly tall, not a bully by any means, not even frightening. He would never take any liberties, but he was right fucking hard, a hard bastard. Now, while McAvoy was undoubtedly as hard as nails character, he also showed great loyalty to those he liked. He knew when to help rather than to hinder. He was shrewd yet arrogant and wanted wealth so bad that he was happy to take advantage of his own popularity. McAvoy was a highly charismatic. Even as a teenager, he was capable of ordering his contemporaries to carry out minor crimes such as stealing milk off doorsteps and bottles of pop from the shops. It was a sign of what was to come. He was, in his words of one of his contemporaries, a strange combination of a hard heart and a soft mind, capable of beating a man, but also just as likely to help an old lady across the road. Now, McAvoy was a genuine creature of circumstance, a product of his tough upbringing and a complex, contradictory man who was utterly dangerous because he did not recognise the traditional boundaries in life, and he'd undoubtedly become addicted to crime from a very early age. Now, by the time he'd left school, McAvoy and his pals were already burglaring and carrying out raids nearby the docks, so it was inevitable that they'd graduate to bank robberies. These were jobs cemented on South London villains' reputation, and more than anything else, once word got round that McAvoy was going across the pavement, then he really would be a made man as far as the rules of the underworld were concerned. Now, the move into the organised crime represented a real step up from young hoodlum, as part of his childhood friends recalled. When you're a blag, it's like being part of a football team. Each person has their role you count on, and the rest of them pull their weight. Now, it's a fantastic feeling when it works out. We get tip-offs like likely target, and the normal percentage for what kind of information was 10% of whatever you get. It was all game, but a fucking lucrative game when it worked. Now, once McAvoy and his gang had picked up a day to commit a blagging, they'd work on getting their tools together and steal a car to ensure a fast getaway. Now, a classic blagging for McAvoy and his young pals would be a man collecting takings from the betting shop. And McAvoy's crew would usually be armed with at least a kosh and just a mere threat that would be enough to persuade their victims to hand over the cash. Now, one veteran robber who worked with McAvoy explained Mickey was well known to being a good man to work with because it was a very sale game. So he was very sound game, and if you went across the pavement, Mickey would be the first one out the car and the first one to grab the dosh. Now, as a young hood with a few bob in his pocket, McAvoy and others, such as his close friend Tony White, began frequenting clubs, dives, spilers, which are basically illegal gambling clubs, and hotels up west. The two youths sometimes worked as enforcers for the violent and unscrupulous characters who ran protection rackets in the West End. Though they were nothing more than hired hands trying to earn some extra cash between robberies, they started to meet older and more experienced villains, including a quite impressive character called Brian Robinson, who had a reputation as a real pro and also became from the southeast London manor. He came from the same southeast London manor as McAvoy. Now, the older, more conservative Brian had spent a few years in the army, where he seemed to have honed his skills before getting out and developing into a very smart, supposedly independent entrepreneur of crime. Now, all of these young villains also learned quickly the importance of greasing palms, especially when it comes to the old bill. Now, that type of bribery and corruption undoubtedly coloured their attitude towards the police in later life. Their argument was simple: how can you trust a copper if one of them wants a backhander? They're all the enemy, and most of them are less honest than we are. Now, characters like McAvoy, Robinson and White didn't recognise anyone in authority, apart from perhaps the occasional criminal name, as they developed into fearsome villains on the streets of southeast London. And as far as they were concerned, policemen, judges and Home Office officials were nobodies. Now, the new generation of villains were on their way up the ladder, and nothing was going to stop them. And when McAvoy had a violent clash with the older southeast London criminal, it looked like he was going to get his comeuppance. But even as a youngster, McAvoy didn't hide from anyone. He said later that taking on his particular face and giving him a right hiding had been a good bit of PR. In other words, he'd sent out a message to all the other criminals that he was already the top dog. Now, a number of southeast London pubs became hotbeds for criminals, and these younger hoods observant and perspective and even watched closely. Just like they'd done it earlier in the dogs, they'd often slide into a bar, sit in the corner, listening to a few dodgy deals going on, and McAvoy's circle of acquaintances grew, and so did his habits. One friend from his school days got himself a job in a meat warehouse and immediately became involved with McAvoy, smuggling out carcasses of beef on lorries. McAvoy had numerous such little earners, and go on, he would constantly look out for new targets. Now, the criminal ascendancy of men like McAvoy, Robinson, White, and many others besides owed much of the period transition that Britain was going through during the 60s and the early 70s. Now, there weren't so many spids on the streets to talk to if you wanted a decent piece of meat for tea, because the Arthur Daly type characters had faded out when wartime rationing ended in the mid-50s. Now people, especially poor, had to fend for themselves, and that forced characters like McAvoy and his pals to go out on the streets and look for new challenges and banks, and were obviously the most lucrative targets. Okay, so what I'm going to do there, folks, because I appreciate I did say that I'm going to do this in parts. So we've basically just covered the first two parts there. I'm going to wrap this up, and I'm going to go, and whoever's still there in the chat, okay, bear with me. Okay, participants. So Joe Delamora, Paul, Suzanne. Okay. Joe, you're still brilliant. So what I'm going to do, everyone, I'm going to wrap this up here. I want to say thank you for your time. Now, that was chapter 2. I'm going to try and go through these. I'm going to go through chapter 3 and onwards, and I'll get this out in segments for you, because I know it's a lot of information, and I appreciate that keeping your interest there as well. It's long, but if anyone's still in there, is anyone still in the chat? Would you want to be able to give us a thumbs up? I just want to make sure I can engage with you Thank you, Suzanne. Oh, thank you, Joe. I appreciate you staying there for that hour. It's a lot of information. Joe, I know that you'd be probably a little bit more, you'll definitely be a lot more au fait with what I was saying and some of the terminologies there. And I have tried giving a breakdown just so so our US crowd could sort of get on board with what I was saying. What I'm gonna do, I'm just gonna wait. If you want to put a question in, Paul, brilliant, thank you. Ralph, thank you. Spirit, thank you. That's no problem. I'm going to break this down into segments so you can kind of go through it in time, because there's no good me doing a 10-hour live. I don't believe in that. I've got to keep talking for starters, and I want you to, maybe you can go away and we can obviously have a chat about before the next live if you're about, and you can send me some questions and we can go through it, and then I can go and start off the next segment until I get to the end of the story. But it's important for me that I give you the backdrop, especially for the folks outside of the UK that obviously need to get a bit of an understanding as well, because there's a lot of different terminologies. There's a lot of things as well, obviously, that are quite obvious to some. You know, especially when I'm talking about the crime, you know, the street code, things like that, which is generally a standard across the world. But I'm going to give you back your time. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Krumel. Thank you, Spirit, Ralph, Paul, Suzanne. That's good. So, yeah, relax, enjoy it. I don't know who's on next, but I know at 2 o'clock my time, we've got ALV. So please go over and join in, which I think is 9 p.m. Eastern time. Is it, Paul? Do you know what, Paul? I'm going to do it sooner. I'm probably going to do it once every couple of days, because I think that I don't want to do it again tomorrow, because I want to get some of my time back, but I don't want to leave it for a week because everyone would have forgotten about it. So let me know, give me your opinion in the chat if you're happy for me to do it 2 days. I will do it tomorrow. Thank you, Claudio. I appreciate that. Thank you, Marta. I will do it tomorrow if you want me to, but I'd ideally like to do it again Sunday. So if you're happy for me to do it on every couple of days, please give me a thumbs up in the chat. No thumbs in the chat. I'm gonna pick up this. Okay, I'm gonna make a decision then. I'm gonna do this Sunday. Yeah, no, exactly, Paul. I do agree. A week is too long. You would have forgot it, and then you've got to watch the hour again. Yeah, tomorrow's good, or Sunday. I'll try and get on tomorrow, okay? Because I think the sooner I get it out, the better, and it's all fresh in your mind. But I was just... So Joe's got thumbs down. So what's that, Joe? Is it Sunday or Saturday, mate? Do you want me to do it tomorrow? Joe, give me a thumbs up if you want me to do it tomorrow. He's not going to respond. Okay, I'll try and do it tomorrow, but it will be Sunday at the latest. Okay, and then we'll fresh this out, because I want to make sure that I get more points out. So, folks, thank you ever so much. I can't do this without you. I really appreciate your help. As I say, this is my 5th live. This is my 5th live. It's practice makes perfect. I'm just trying to get these words out, get my speech going, but and keep you entertained as well. Brilliant. No, thank you. I appreciate that. Cheers, Joe. Right, everyone. Peace out. I really agree with you all. Good folks. Enjoy your evening.